My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 42 years old. I met him on a quiet afternoon in the Dominican Republic, at an hour when even tourists are quiet. He was older, maybe in his 60s, sitting alone in the shade, not observing anything in particular. We started talking casually, about the heat, about the ocean, about how strange it was when everything finally slowed down. At some point, I noticed something was missing. His phone wasn't there. It wasn't on the table, it wasn't in his hand, it wasn't even close. I asked him about it, expecting a joke. Instead, he told me he hadn't had a phone in 15 years. He said he'd worked with technology his whole life, helping create systems designed to connect people, and somehow, in the end, he felt more disconnected than ever. Then he said something that stayed with me long after the trip was over. He said that what Americans would call the norm in 2026 would be unbearable for most human brains within a decade. Before I could ask what he meant, my wife interrupted us. And then it was just a story, but his last sentence became the one I remembered for the rest of my life. Before I tell you what happened after that conversation, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and, if you feel like it, write in the comments how much time you spend on your phone each day. Now let's continue our story. The flight home should have felt ordinary. I'd taken that route before, sat in those same narrow seats, watched the same clouds stretch and dissolve beneath the wing. But this time something felt slightly off, like a low sound you can't quite locate. My phone was in my pocket the entire flight, fully charged, buzzing occasionally with things I chose not to check, but my mind kept returning to the man's voice. Not the whole conversation, just that one sentence, replaying without context, as if my mind were trying to finish it on its own. Looking around the cabin, I noticed how similar everyone looked in that moment. Heads tilted down, screens glowing softly, fingers moving in small, practiced motions. No one seemed unhappy. No one seemed distressed. And yet there was a sameness to it that unsettled me, like watching a room full of people breathing just a little too fast and calling it normal. When we landed, life resumed immediately. Messages came in before we even reached the gate. Work questions, calendar reminders. I responded automatically, slipping back into a rhythm that felt efficient and familiar. For a while, the thought of the man in the Dominican Republic faded into the background. Not gone, just quieter, like something placed on a shelf with the assumption I'd return to it later. Over the next few days, I began noticing small things that hadn't bothered me before. How often my hand reached for my phone without any clear reason. How waiting in line felt uncomfortable if I wasn't scrolling. How silence, real silence without background noise, made me restless in a way I couldn't fully explain. Nothing dramatic happened. There were no sudden realizations. Just the growing sense that my attention rarely stayed in one place for very long. At work, I was functioning exactly as expected. If anything, I was doing well. I answered emails quickly, stayed on top of projects. People relied on me because I was always reachable. Somewhere along the way, that availability had quietly become part of my value. Still, by the end of each day, I felt oddly depleted, as if I'd spent hours reacting instead of thinking. Driving home, I struggled to remember the details of the afternoon, not because they were unimportant, but because nothing had held my focus long enough to leave a clear impression. One evening, a few weeks after we returned, I sat alone at the kitchen table after my wife had gone to bed. The house was quiet. No television. No music. I placed my phone face down in front of me and realized how rarely I did that. There was a faint tension in my chest, like I was waiting for something to happen. A message. An update. Proof that I was still connected. I thought again about the man sitting in the shade, apparently content to watch nothing at all, and for the first time I wondered what that actually felt like from the inside. I picked up my phone out of habit and unlocked it. The screen lit up instantly, bright and demanding. And in that moment, I understood why his unfinished sentence had stayed with me. Not because it predicted some dramatic collapse, but because it named a discomfort I had been quietly living with for years without language. I didn't change anything that night. I didn't make a decision or set rules for myself. I just noticed something. And once you notice something like that, it becomes very hard to ignore. The next morning, everything looked the same. The same routine. The same responsibilities. The same expectations waiting for me. That familiarity made it easy to move forward as if nothing had changed. But there was a slight pause now, a fraction of a second between impulse and action, especially when it came to my phone. Sometimes I'd reach for it and stop. Sometimes I'd open it and forget why. It wasn't discipline or intention. It felt more like curiosity mixed with unease, as if I'd started noticing a background noise that had always been there. I didn't talk about it to anyone, not because it felt secret, but because it felt unfinished, like trying to explain a thought before it had fully formed. All I knew was that whatever the man in the Dominican Republic had stepped away from 15 years earlier, it wasn't just a device. It was a way of moving through the world that suddenly felt less neutral than I'd assumed. The first real test came by accident. One evening, after a long day of meetings that blurred together, more reminding me how fragmented my attention had become, I left the house to run a few errands. I didn't realize my phone was still on the kitchen counter until I was already in the car, halfway down the street. My first instinct was to turn back. The idea of being unreachable, even briefly, made my chest tighten. Nothing urgent was waiting for me. No one would notice. Still, the absence felt heavier than it should have. I kept driving. At the store, I reached into my pocket without thinking, my hand closing around nothing. Standing in line, the world felt louder than usual. The hum of the refrigeration units. A child crying somewhere down the aisle. My own breathing. Without my phone, there was nowhere to send my attention. It wasn't peaceful. It was raw. Driving home, time felt stretched, unfamiliar. My thoughts moved in longer arcs. Memories surfaced without warning, uninvited. When I finally got home and saw my phone where I'd left it, I felt relief, followed unexpectedly by disappointment. That night, lying in bed, I thought again about the man in the Dominican Republic. I wondered if his first days without a phone had felt like this. Not freeing, not enlightening, just uncomfortable in a way that demanded endurance. I imagined the restlessness, the urge to escape one's own thoughts, the temptation to reach for something familiar. Whatever peace he'd found, I realized, must have come later. Over the following weeks, I began creating small absences on purpose, leaving my phone in another room during dinner, taking short walks without it, telling myself I didn't need music or a map for 15 minutes. Each time, the same pattern repeated. Restlessness, irritation, and then, gradually, a subtle settling I hadn't felt in years. My thoughts resisted at first, then slowly quieted. Not completely, just enough for me to feel the difference. What surprised me most was how difficult it felt to talk about. This wasn't something I wanted to frame as a productivity experiment or a lifestyle change. The moment I imagined explaining it that way, it lost whatever honesty it had. This wasn't about becoming better or more efficient. It was about realizing how unfamiliar my own inner rhythm had become and how much effort it now took simply to stay with myself. The first real change didn't come from a decision. It came from a mistake. One evening, I left my phone at home when I went out to run a few errands. I didn't realize it until I was already in the car, halfway down the street, and for a moment I considered turning back. Nothing urgent was waiting for me. No one would notice. Still, the idea of being unreachable felt heavier than it should have. I kept driving anyway, more out of stubbornness than intention. The discomfort arrived almost immediately. At the store, I caught myself reaching into my pocket, my hand closing around nothing. Standing in line, I became aware of sounds I usually filtered out. A child crying somewhere down the aisle. The hum of machines. The rhythm of my own breathing. It wasn't peaceful. It was exposed. I realized how accustomed I'd become to smoothing over those edges, to dulling reality just enough to make it easier to move through. Driving home, time felt strange, stretched in a way that made me uneasy. My thoughts moved in longer arcs instead of jumping from one thing to the next. Memories surfaced without warning. Conversations from years earlier. Decisions I hadn't revisited in a long time. None of it felt profound. It felt unfiltered. When I finally walked back into the house and saw my phone on the counter, I felt relief, followed by something I hadn't expected. Disappointment. That night, lying in bed, I thought again about the man in the Dominican Republic. I wondered if his first days without a phone had felt like this. Not freeing, not calming, just uncomfortable in a way that shows you how restless your mind has become. I imagined the habit of reaching for something that was no longer there, the urge to escape one's own thoughts. Whatever peace he'd found, I realized, must have come later. Over the next few weeks, I began creating small absences on purpose. I left my phone in another room during dinner. I went for short walks without it, telling myself I didn't need music or directions for 15 minutes. Each time, the The same pattern repeated. First restlessness, then irritation, and finally, a subtle settling I hadn't felt in years. My thoughts resisted at first, then gradually slowed. Not completely, just enough for me to notice the difference. What surprised me most was how reluctant I felt to talk about it. This wasn't something I wanted to turn into a system or a challenge. The moment I framed it that way, it lost its honesty. This wasn't about improvement. It was about realizing how unfamiliar my own inner rhythm had become and how much effort it now took simply to stay with myself. The longer I stayed with those small absences, the more I noticed what they cost me. My attention felt deeper, but narrower. When I focused on something, I stayed with it longer, and that intensity was exhausting in a way distraction had never been. I began to understand that the constant stimulation I'd lived with for years hadn't just scattered my attention. It had also given me a kind of rest. Removing it meant confronting fatigue I'd been postponing. At work, the shift became visible in small ways. I was slower to respond, less available. I missed a message once, then a call. Nothing serious happened, but the expectation was there, unspoken but firm, that I would always be reachable. I realized how much of my professional value had quietly become tied to that readiness, and how risky it felt to loosen my grip on it. There were moments when I questioned everything. Sitting alone without my phone didn't automatically make me calmer or clearer. Sometimes it made me restless, irritable, even sad for reasons I couldn't immediately name. Old memories surfaced without warning. Regrets I'd managed to keep at a distance felt closer. It occurred to me that distraction hadn't just filled time. It had protected me from parts of myself I didn't always want to face. The temptation to return to old habits was constant. A quick glance promised relief and delivered it briefly. But afterward, the contrast felt sharper. I could feel how quickly my attention scattered, how the quiet I'd grown used to dissolve into a familiar hum. That hum had once felt comforting. Now it felt hollow. Around this time, I noticed how other people moved through their days. Couples at dinner, both half present. Parents pushing strollers, eyes dropping to their screens between steps. Meetings where no one was openly disengaged, yet no one was fully there either. We had learned how to be absent politely, how to divide ourselves into manageable fragments and call it balance. At home, the changes were quieter but more personal. My wife noticed I was more present during conversations, less likely to drift. She also noticed when I seemed drained afterward, as if being fully there had used something up. When she asked if something was wrong, I told her I was tired. It was true, but incomplete. I didn't yet have the language to explain what was shifting underneath. By then, the man in the Dominican Republic felt less like a memory and more like a reference point. Not someone to imitate, but someone who had crossed a threshold I was only beginning to approach. I could see now that his choice hadn't been about rejecting the world. It had been about choosing a different relationship with it, one that allowed for depth at the expense of constant connection. I didn't know how far I was willing to go. I only knew that returning fully to the way things had been felt less possible with each passing day. The shift didn't stay private for long. Other people noticed before I was ready to name it myself. It started with small comments, delivered casually, almost jokingly. Someone asking if everything was okay because I'd taken longer to reply. A colleague saying it was harder to get a hold of me lately. Nothing accusatory. But underneath the tone, I felt the expectation clearly. Availability wasn't a preference. It was a baseline. What I didn't say out loud was that the slowness felt deliberate, necessary. There were moments now when my mind stayed with a single thought instead of jumping between 10. Problems didn't resolve faster, but they resolved deeper. Ideas unfolded instead of arriving half-formed. That kind of thinking felt unfamiliar, but it carried weight. And with that weight came responsibility. When you're no longer distracted, you can't blame distraction for shallow outcomes. Late one night, unable to sleep, I stood by the window and looked out at the street below. A few houses glowed faintly, blue light leaking through curtains. Entire lives unfolding in that glow. Conversations, conflicts, decisions happening quietly behind glass and screens. The man's unfinished sentence returned to me again, sharper now. What he'd hinted at wasn't collapse. It was overload. A point where the human nervous system simply refuses to keep up. I began questioning things I'd never questioned before. Why every thought needed an outlet. Why every pause required filling. Without the phone, questions lingered longer. They didn't dissolve immediately. Some of them demanded action instead of distraction. Silence, I realized, didn't just bring calm. It brought responsibility. At work, something subtle shifted. In meetings, I spoke less often, but more deliberately. I wasn't performing clarity. I was waiting for it. The room felt different. People listened longer. After one meeting, a senior partner pulled me aside and asked what had changed. I didn't have a clean answer. I just said I'd been thinking more carefully lately. He nodded, as if that explained more than I realized. That was the moment I understood attention wasn't just personal. It was contagious. When one person slowed down, others adjusted, even unconsciously. That idea unsettled me more than any warning about the future. If attention could shape rooms and decisions, then what had we been shaping all these years by constantly dividing it? By then, the man in the Dominican Republic no longer felt distant. He felt uncomfortably close. I could imagine him years earlier, noticing the same frictions, the same exhaustion, and choosing a path that must have looked irrational from the outside. I began to understand the courage that required. Not the courage to disconnect, but the courage to stand out. The question was no longer whether he'd been right. The question was what I was willing to do with that understanding. The decision didn't arrive as a dramatic moment. It formed quietly, as the cost of staying the same began to outweigh the risk of changing. I noticed how often decisions were being driven by speed rather than judgment. How urgency replaced responsibility. The faster something moved, the less accountable anyone felt for where it was going. That realization made it harder to stay passive. I started testing changes carefully. Fewer interruptions, clearer boundaries, time that was actually protected instead of theoretically available. On the surface, it looked like optimization. In practice, it slowed everything down. I framed it in language the system understood, but underneath, it was something else entirely. A refusal to treat attention as endlessly available. The pushback came gradually. First appreciation, then discomfort, questions about responsiveness, concerns about falling behind. I listened, aware that every objection was reasonable. I wasn't trying to prove a point. I was trying to see how much depth the system could tolerate before it rejected it. One evening, after a long day of conversations that went nowhere and everywhere at once, I sat alone in my office long after most people had left. The building was quiet in a way that amplifies your own thoughts. I thought again about the man in the Dominican Republic and realized he hadn't been warning me about the future. He'd been describing a fork in the road. One path led to constant adaptation, the other to deliberate restraint. Considered slowness. Most people never noticed the fork at all. What finally pushed me forward wasn't fear. It was clarity. The understanding that attention shapes outcomes long before anyone notices. That the rules of any system quietly favor those who can stay with complexity the longest. I knew that if I kept operating inside the same rhythm, I would eventually lose the very capacity that made my work meaningful. So I stopped treating it as a personal experiment. I formalized the changes. I made them structural, not because I wanted control, but because I understood how fragile individual discipline is inside a system designed to override it. The reaction was immediate and uneven. Some people felt relief. Others felt threatened. A few were openly skeptical. I accepted all of it. Change at this level always reveals who benefits most from the old rules. Driving home that night, through nearly empty streets, I thought again about the unfinished sentence. I realized I no longer needed it completed. I was living inside the answer now, feeling its resistance and its cost. Whatever the man had recovered in those 15 years without a phone wasn't peace in the way people imagine it. It was something sturdier. The ability to choose where your mind rests, even when the world keeps pulling at it. And sitting there in the dark, phone untouched beside me, I understood this was the point of no return. The changes didn't announce themselves. There were no headlines, no clear moment where everything shifted at once. Instead, the effects appeared in places no one thought to measure. Meetings lasted longer, but fewer of them felt pointless. Conversations slowed, then deepened. People left rooms less exhausted, even when the work itself was harder. I watched it happen carefully, aware of how fragile it all was. Systems don't reject change loudly at first. They wait to see if it will collapse on its own. Not everything improved. Some relationships thinned. A few people drifted away, uncomfortable with the new pace, unwilling to give up the constant stimulation they relied on. I didn't blame them. Choosing depth means choosing limits. And limits feel like loss when you've been taught that more is always better. There were days I wondered if I'd pushed too far, if the discomfort I'd introduced outweighed the clarity it brought. But each time I considered reversing course, I noticed the same thing. The quiet held. It didn't demand attention. It simply stayed. At home, the change settled differently. Evenings stretched. Silence became something we shared instead of something to fill. There were moments of tension when the absence of distraction left nowhere to hide, but there was honesty in that. And honesty, I learned, is exhausting and necessary in equal measure. We didn't talk about phones much anymore. We talked about energy, about presence, about what it feels like to actually arrive in your own life. Every so often, I thought about the man in the Dominican Republic, not as a guide or a symbol, but as an interruption that had come at the right moment. I knew I'd never see him again. That was part of it. He hadn't been meant to follow me through this. He'd been meant to shift the direction slightly and disappear. Some encounters exist only to open a door you didn't know was there. Once you walk through it, they no longer belong to you. The world didn't slow down. If anything, it sped up. The noise grew louder. The demands became more insistent. But my relationship to it had changed. I no longer mistook constant input for awareness or speed for progress. I'd felt the difference too clearly to pretend otherwise. Whatever people choose to call normal in the years ahead, I know this much. The human mind keeps score, even when we don't. Sometimes, late at night, I sit outside and do nothing at all. No phone, no music, no plan, just air moving and thoughts arriving at their own pace. In those moments, I think of that afternoon in the shade, the way the man looked as if he were watching nothing and everything at once. He wasn't withdrawing from the world. He was meeting it on terms that didn't cost him his inner life. And once you've felt that kind of attention settle into place, you don't forget it. You carry it quietly, even as the world keeps pulling at you. If this story resonated with you, let me know what moment stayed with you the longest in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe to the channel. Quiet change doesn't announce itself, but once you notice it, it has a way of staying with you.